The fall beneath alien waters. The twin suns of Vathar burned low over the horizon, painting the silver oceans in shades of violet and gold. High above the restless waters floated the royal docks of House Varex, a city of shining glass and living metal. It was a day of celebration, for the young heir, Prince Kael, was to witness his first voyage aboard the royal skyship. The crowd gathered in colorful robes, music filled the air, and alien banners danced in the warm wind. But fate often hides behind moments of joy. From the edge of the platform, Kael leaned forward, curious eyes fixed on the swirling mist below. The ocean of Vathar was alive. It breathed, it whispered, and every wave carried dangerous beauty. It was called the Vein Sea, a body of water charged with natural energy currents that could melt through armor and machinery. Even the bravest soldiers feared its depths. But Kael was young and proud. He wanted to see what no one else dared. He stepped too close, just 1 inch too far, and the polished floor betrayed him. The scream that followed tore through the sky. The royal guards rushed forward, but it was too late. The boy's body broke through the light barrier and plunged straight into the glowing waters below. Shock spread across the crowd like wildfire. "Air down! Air down!" shouted the soldiers, but no one moved to dive in. Every creature in the sea carried enough voltage to kill a dozen men in seconds. The water itself was death. Far from the chaos, a human cargo vessel drifted near the royal dock's perimeter. Its captain, Ryan Cole, watched the scene unfold on his monitor. The alarms from the royal city echoed through his comms. His crew shouted warnings, "Stay back, Captain! That water kills everything!" But Ryan wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the small figure falling, the ripples spreading wider and wider. He didn't know who the child was. He didn't care. He only saw someone drowning while others hesitated. Without a word, Ryan grabbed his oxygen mask, sealed his pressure suit halfway, and leapt from his ship. The wind tore at his body as he fell, slicing through the mist like a bullet. He hit the surface hard, and pain shot through every nerve as static energy crawled over his skin. The sensors in his suit screamed warnings, but he pushed deeper. Lightning flashed around him, glowing creatures darted through the water, and the world became a storm of light and shadow. Up above, the aliens watched in horror. "A human dove into the Vein Sea. He's mad," one shouted. Even the king, standing motionless on the high balcony, felt his heart's twist. He had already turned away, believing both the human and his son would be lost to the storm below. But down in the dark, Ryan was fighting with everything he had. He followed the faint shimmer of the boy's robe, reaching through clouds of glowing plankton and streams of deadly current. Every movement felt like being struck by lightning. His breath was running out, his vision blurring, yet his hand finally brushed against cold, trembling skin. Kael's eyes fluttered open for a moment underwater. Through the blur, he saw a face unlike any he'd seen before. A human's face, full of determination and pain. Ryan wrapped one arm around the boy and kicked upward with the last strength in his legs. The sea tried to pull them back down, the current wrapping like chains around their bodies, but he fought harder. When they finally broke the surface, both gasped, the stormlight reflecting in their eyes like twin flames. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd stared from above, unable to believe what they were seeing. A human was holding the royal heir in his arms. The king's voice trembled as he whispered, "Impossible." Ryan swam toward the dock, dragging the limp body of the boy. His suit was smoking. His skin burned in places where the water had eaten through the fabric. When he reached the edge, he lifted Kael up to the waiting guards. No one helped him. They were frozen between fear and disbelief. As he tried to climb out, one of the guards raised a weapon. "Don't touch him!" the guard shouted. "You'll contaminate the air." Ryan's voice cracked as he yelled, "He's not breathing!" But the aliens stepped back in panic. The air grew thick with tension. Kael lay pale and lifeless, his small chest still. The king's crown tilted as he stepped closer, torn between royal law and a father's fear. And then, as thunder rolled across the sea, Ryan made a choice that would change both their worlds. He placed his hands over the alien boy's chest and began to push. Once, twice, again and again, breathing life where others saw death. Each breath echoed through the royal dock. The alien guards whispered in disbelief. The king's hands clenched. The sea grew quiet, as if the planet itself was watching. On the 10th breath, Kael coughed. A stream of silver-blue water spilled from his mouth. His small hand clutched Ryan's wrist, weak but alive. The boy's glowing eyes opened, trembling, and he whispered one word through cracked lips. "Human?" The crowd gasped. The king staggered backward, speechless, and in that moment, under the crimson suns of Vathar, a bond was forged that would shake an empire and echo across generations. Breath of two worlds. The storm had quieted, but the royal docks of Vathar were filled with heavy silence. The human stood motionless, dripping with the burning seawater that had nearly killed him, while the alien guards surrounded him with weapons raised. Ryan's chest rose and fell slowly, his body trembling, but his eyes never left the boy lying in front of him. The young heir, Kael, breathed unevenly, small chest lifting with fragile life. His skin shimmered faintly with bioluminescent lines, the mark of royal blood, and the faint glow flickered as if deciding whether to stay or fade. Around them, hundreds of alien nobles and soldiers stood frozen, unable to understand what they had just seen. They had witnessed something their faith said could never happen. A human had defied the will of the sea and returned the heir of Vathar from death itself. The king descended from his high balcony, his royal cloak dragging against the wet marble, his face pale beneath the golden light of the setting suns. His eyes were fixed on the human, on this strange being from a lesser world who had dared to touch divine blood. Every step the king took echoed like a drumbeat across the dock. When he reached his son, he knelt beside Kael and touched his cheek with trembling claws. "My son," he whispered, his voice heavy with disbelief and grief. "You are alive." His eyes rose to meet Ryan's, filled not with gratitude, but confusion and fear. "What have you done, human? What sorcery was this?" Ryan's voice was hoarse and tired. "No magic," he said simply. "Just air, just hands, just trying to keep him alive." He looked down at the boy, whose fingers still clutched weakly at his sleeve. Ryan's suit was torn open at the side, his skin burned and marked by veins of electric scars, yet he didn't flinch. He needed help. "That's all." The alien priests arrived moments later, their long black robes gliding over the floor, symbols of the deep currents shining across their hoods. They surrounded the boy, murmuring chants to cleanse him from the taint of the foreigner. One priest turned sharply toward the king. "Your Majesty, the human has touched the heir's sacred form. His breath now mingles with royal blood. If the contamination spreads, the prophecy will fall. The line of the sea will end," the crowd murmured in fear. The king's hand shook as he touched the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "Take him," he said quietly, "before his presence defiles the child any further." Ryan did not resist as the guards grabbed his arms and pulled him back. His knees hit the cold metal, and he winced but said nothing. He looked one last time toward Kael, who lay unconscious now in the arms of his father. For a brief moment the boy's eyes fluttered open again, half awake, and searched the air until they found the human's face. His lips moved weakly, trying to speak, but no sound came. Then the guards dragged Ryan away into the shadowed corridors of the royal city. They locked him inside a transparent containment sphere deep below the palace, a cell built for display more than for punishment. From inside, he could see the glowing skyline of Vathar through the curved glass, the towers rising like silver roots into the sky. The air was cold and smelled faintly of salt and metal. Outside, alien scientists and guards passed by, staring at him as if he were a wild beast. Some looked with disgust, others with curiosity, and a few with silent respect. Ryan sat on the metal floor, his hands bandaged by the burns he'd sustained in the sea, his mind playing the same image again and again. The boy's hand grabbing his wrist, that small trembling voice whispering, "Human." Hours passed. The world outside continued its rituals, but inside his cell, time moved differently. He thought about his own planet far across the stars, where the oceans were blue and calm, where saving a drowning child was not a crime, but a duty. He had been a soldier once, then a traitor, and now, apparently, a prisoner for doing what his conscience demanded. Yet, even as the silence pressed around him, there was something deep inside him that refused to feel regret. Late that night, the faint hum of the energy walls broke for a moment, and a figure stepped out of the shadows. A tall woman draped in royal blue robes. Her eyes glowed the same pale light as the Heir's, and her voice was soft yet commanding. It was the Queen. She dismissed the guards with a wave of her hand and approached Ryan's cell. "You risked death," she said quietly, her voice carrying the echo of the sea. "You defied the current and the will of our gods. Tell me, human, why?" Ryan stood slowly, his body weak but his gaze steady. "Because he was a child," he said. "Because no one else was moving. Because where I come from, we don't stand by and watch someone die if we can help." The Queen's expression softened. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she touched the edge of the glass, her fingers trembling. "Our people fear what they do not understand," she whispered. "But the ocean saw you, and it did not take you. Perhaps that means something." Her eyes flicked up toward the ceiling, where distant thunder rolled once again across the waves. "Perhaps you were meant to fall here just as he did." And with that, she turned and vanished back into the corridors of gold and shadow, leaving Ryan alone with his thoughts and a growing realization that what had begun as a moment of instinct was already rippling into something far larger than he could imagine. The trial of contamination days passed since the fall into the deadly sea, and yet the royal halls of Vathar still trembled under whispers. The people of the floating city spoke in half-breaths and hushed tones, for never in all history had a human touched the royal bloodline. To the priests it was sacrilege, to the soldiers it was confusion, and to the common people it was awe. Some said the ocean had chosen Ryan, that no human could have survived the vain sea unless the deep itself had spared him. Others called it luck, foolishness, or an omen of war. But none could ignore the truth. The alien Heir still lived, and it was the human who had brought him back. Ryan sat in the transparent prison chamber that hung in the palace like a crystal tear, high above the endless waters. From there, he could see the silver storms dancing over the sea, and at night, lightning painted the world in shades of violet. He spent hours watching it, wondering if he would ever see the blue skies of Earth again. His burns were healing, but his spirit was weighed down by uncertainty. The guards no longer looked at him with pure hatred. Some brought him food quietly, their eyes betraying curiosity more than disgust. A few even whispered among themselves that the king was torn between executing the human or honoring his courage. In the royal chambers, the king paced before the throne, torn between love for his son and loyalty to his people's ancient faith. The priests filled the air with fearful words, warning him that the breath of man had cursed the Heir's blood. "Your Majesty," the high priest rasped, his many eyes reflecting the torchlight, "the contamination must be purified. The human's touch lingers upon the child. You must sever it before it spreads." The king slammed his clawed hand against the armrest of his throne, his voice rising with suppressed fury. "You speak of my son as if he were already dead. The boy breathes because of that human's hands." But tradition was a heavy chain around the king's heart. Every royal bloodline of Vathar was believed to be born from the sea spirit itself. Any outside interference, especially from humans, was seen as a corruption of the divine. The people demanded a trial, a spectacle to cleanse the royal name. And so it was decided that the human would stand before the court of Vathar at sunrise, where his fate would be sealed before the eyes of all. When the dawn came, the grand plaza overflowed with aliens of every rank. Massive banners of silver silk hung from the towers, and the ocean below shimmered with strange blue mist. Ryan was brought forth in chains made of energy, his steps slow but steady. He looked small beside the towering guards, yet there was something unbroken in his eyes. The alien citizens murmured as he passed, some cursing, others bowing their heads in quiet respect. The king sat upon his throne of crystal, the queen at his side, her expression unreadable. The high priest raised his staff and spoke to the crowd, his voice echoing through the open air. "Behold the human who defied the will of the sea, who laid hands upon the royal blood. The ocean demands balance. The sacred must be purified. The crowd roared in response, half in rage, half in fear. Ryan stood silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where lightning touched the waves like veins of fire. Just then, the sound of footsteps broke through the noise. From behind the throne came a smaller figure, pale and fragile but alive. The young Prince Kael. The crowd gasped, for he had not appeared in public since his rescue. His body was still weak, but his voice carried with quiet strength. "Stop this," he said, his glowing eyes fixed on the priests. "The sea did not take me because the sea did not wish to, and it did not kill the human, because he was meant to save me." The priests tried to silence him, but the king lifted a hand, his expression torn between pride and fear. Kyle stepped closer to Ryan, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. His hand, still trembling, reached out toward the human. The guards moved to stop him, but the queen's voice rang clear. "Let him speak." Kael's small fingers touched Ryan's wrist, and a faint shimmer of light passed between them, a pulse of life energy that silenced the entire plaza. "I was dead," Kael whispered, his voice filled with awe. "But he gave me breath. He gave me life. If that is corruption, then maybe the sea has changed its will." The crowd fell into a stunned silence. Even the priests stepped back, uncertain. The king rose slowly from his throne, his eyes glistening with something between anger and sorrow. "You have changed everything, human," he said in a deep voice that echoed through the plaza. "The faith of my people trembles because of you. You have saved my son, but you may destroy our order." Ryan lifted his head, meeting the king's gaze without defiance, only truth. "I didn't come here to change your world," he said quietly. "I just couldn't let a child drown." The king stared at him for a long moment, the winds howling between them, and then he turned away. "Lock him away," he said at last, his voice heavy, "until I understand what the sea truly wants." As the guards led Ryan back to his cell, Kael's voice broke through the silence once more, soft, pleading, and filled with something no one could explain. "Please, don't hurt him." And those words, simple and fragile, began to echo through every corridor of the royal palace, carried by servants, guards, and even the wind itself. It was the beginning of a change none of them were ready for. The first breath of two worlds learning to meet without fear. The silent storm. The palace of Vathar had become a fortress of silence. Since the trial, no laughter or music had echoed through its halls, and the royal banners that once shimmered with pride now hung still in the cold air. The king had withdrawn into his chamber. The queen spoke to no one, and the guards who once stood proud now carried doubt in their eyes. The rescue of the heir by a human had cracked something deeper than law. It had fractured belief. The priests whispered of curses, the soldiers murmured of miracles, and the people below wondered if the gods of the sea had finally chosen to speak through the stranger who defied death. But beneath that uneasy calm, rebellion began to stir in the shadows, a storm forming in silence, unseen yet heavy in the air. Ryan sat inside his cell high above the ocean, staring at the horizon through the translucent walls. The storms outside never stopped, flashes of lightning crawling across the sky like silver serpents. Days had passed since the trial, yet no verdict had come. Food arrived without words, guards stood without looking him in the eyes, and the sound of the sea was his only company. But what troubled him most was the thought of the boy, the young heir he had saved. Kael had not visited, and Ryan feared that the king had locked him away from the public eye, afraid of the growing unrest. Still, somewhere deep within, Ryan felt that the bond between them, born in darkness and drowning, had not been broken. One night, as the moonlight bled across the sea and the air hummed with electric quiet, Ryan heard a faint tapping on the glass. He rose slowly, his eyes narrowing, and saw a small shape moving in the shadows outside his cell. For a heartbeat he thought it was a trick of the light, but then a familiar voice whispered, "Ryan!" The human froze. It was Kael. The boy stood beyond the energy barrier, his small form wrapped in a silver cloak, his face pale but determined. "You shouldn't be here," Ryan said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Kael smiled faintly. "Neither should you. But I had to see you. They say you are dangerous. They say you changed me. Maybe that's true." Ryan stepped closer to the barrier, his eyes softening. "I didn't change you, kid. I just made sure you'd get another chance to live." Kyle's gaze lowered for a moment, his voice trembling with honesty. "I saw something in the water that day. When I was sinking, I thought I saw light around you, as if the sea itself let you pass. My people say no human could survive the vain sea, but you did. What if the ocean chose you?" Ryan smiled, but his voice carried sadness. "The ocean didn't choose me, Kael. I just jumped. Sometimes that's all it takes, to not wait for someone else to act." Before they could say more, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Kael's eyes widened. "The guards," he whispered. "They must not see me here." He turned to leave, but Ryan called softly, "Kael, don't stop being who you are. The courage you have, that's what your people need. Not fear." Kael nodded once, his eyes shining, then disappeared into the shadows just as the guards arrived. The moment passed like a ripple over still water, unnoticed by those who lived only by rules and rituals, but it carried the weight of destiny in its silence. That same night, deep beneath the palace, rebellion struck. A group of zealots loyal to the old faith had infiltrated the royal compound, believing the heir's survival was a curse upon the world. They called themselves the Purifiers, and their leader, an old priest who had once served in the Temple of Tides, declared that both the heir and the human must die to cleanse the kingdom. The guards were overwhelmed within minutes. Alarms blared across the towers, the air filled with the scream of plasma rifles, and the peaceful city that had floated in silver calm now burned under crimson fire. Ryan was thrown from his bed as the explosion shook the structure. The power in his cell flickered, and for the first time the energy field vanished. Smoke filled the air, sirens howled, and through the chaos, he heard the unmistakable sound of Kael's voice crying out from above. Without hesitation, Ryan ran. His body was weak, his burns reopened, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He raced through the corridors, past burning metal and fallen guards, his breath ragged, his heart pounding with only one thought: find the boy. He found Kael cornered in a shattered hall, the light from the fires flickering across his terrified face. A purifier stood over him with a blade made of energy, its hum sharp and cold. Without thinking, Ryan hurled himself forward, his body colliding with the attacker, taking the blade through his shoulder. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't stop. He wrestled the weapon away, slammed the zealot to the floor, and kicked the blade out of reach. Kael screamed as Ryan staggered, blood running down his arm, but his voice remained steady. "Stay behind me," he said, turning to face the next wave of shadows approaching from the smoke. The assassins hesitated. The sight of the human standing, wounded yet unyielding, unsettled them. His eyes burned not with hatred, but something far more dangerous: resolve. Lightning flashed through the shattered ceiling, illuminating the two figures framed against the storm, a human bleeding and an alien heir clinging to his back. For a moment, time seemed to pause, and even the rebels felt the weight of what they were seeing. A creature of flesh and fear standing between death and destiny, not as conqueror or subject, but as protector. When the royal guard finally arrived, they found Ryan still standing, his weapon arm trembling, the floor slick with blood but his eyes unbroken. Kael was safe behind him, silent but alive, holding on to the human who had once again defied the storm. The king arrived moments later, stunned by the sight. He looked at the human, at his son, and for the first time, the great ruler of Vathar felt something no war or crown had ever given him: humility. That night, as the fires were extinguished and the palace rebuilt its walls, one truth spread across every level of the city. When the gods of the sea failed to protect their own, it was a human heart that did. A kingdom's choice. The morning after the attack arrived heavy and gray. The floating palace of Vathar, once radiant and filled with the hum of life, now stood scarred and silent. The air smelled of burnt metal and sea salt, the echoes of chaos still hanging like ghosts in the wind. Craters marked the marble floors where energy weapons had exploded. the once bright banners of the royal house now torn and blackened by smoke. Yet among all this destruction, one image lingered in the memory of every soldier, every servant, and every noble who had survived that night: the sight of a human, bloodied and broken, standing over their prince like an unmovable wall. It was not something anyone could easily forget. Ryan lay unconscious in the royal infirmary, his body a map of scars and burns, his arm bound in strange alien fibers that glowed faintly as they worked to heal him. The queen sat by his side in silence, her hands clasped together as she watched his chest rise and fall. For the first time in her long life, she found herself praying, not to the sea, not to the gods, but to the strength of this strange man from a distant world, who had shown her people what it meant to protect without expecting reward. Every breath he took was a defiance of their fear, and every wound upon his body was proof of something greater than faith. It was the proof of heart. Outside, the king stood before his council in the shattered throne hall. The high priest was gone, slain in the chaos of the rebellion, but many of his followers still lived. They bowed their heads before the throne, demanding justice, demanding that the human be removed before his influence poisoned the kingdom further. "Your Majesty," one of them said, voice trembling with fear and conviction, "this creature has brought ruin upon us. His presence divides our people. The gods sent this rebellion as a warning. If you let him live, the sea will abandon us." The king listened, silent, his gaze lost in the broken stained glass above them, where sunlight now poured through in uneven beams. Then came another voice, soft yet strong, the queen's voice. She entered the hall without announcement, her eyes filled with calm fury. "The sea did not abandon us," she said. "The sea watched as our faith failed, as our fear turned us against mercy. And when no one moved, it was this man, a human, who stood between my son and death. Not once, but twice. Tell me, which god among us would have done the same?" The murmurs rose and fell like waves, some in agreement, others in resistance. The king's gaze shifted to the center of the hall where his son now stood. Kael wore a simple tunic, his once delicate frame now marked with quiet strength. His small hands were clenched at his sides, and his voice trembled not with fear but conviction. "Father," he said, his voice carrying through the silence, "if we destroy those who show us kindness, what kind of kingdom are we ruling? The sea took me once, but the human gave me life again. If that is corruption, then maybe our faith has been blind." The court erupted in whispers, the sound of disbelief filling the vast chamber. But the king did not move. He looked into his son's glowing eyes, the same eyes that once held fear but now held wisdom, and he saw something he could no longer deny. Slowly, the king rose from his throne. His voice, when it came, was deep and filled with the weight of centuries. "You speak with courage, my son, perhaps more than I ever have. I have ruled by the will of our gods. But maybe it is time we remember that the gods do not breathe for us. It is we who choose how to live." He turned toward the guards who stood frozen at the edges of the hall. "Bring the human here." Moments later, Ryan entered the hall, supported by 2 soldiers. His steps were slow, his face pale, but his eyes were alive. He looked around at the crowd of alien faces, some hostile, some filled with silent respect, and then his gaze settled on the king. He did not bow. He simply stood, exhausted yet unyielding. The king studied him for a long moment, then stepped down from the throne, something no ruler had ever done before in front of his court. He stopped before Ryan, his shadow falling over the human's burned figure, and spoke in a voice that carried across the hall. "You saved my son. Twice. You risked your life for what my own soldiers would not. You defied the sea, you defied death, and you defied me. And yet you did so not for glory or gold, but because you could not stand still while another suffered. In doing so, you have shown my people something they have forgotten, what it means to be brave." He drew the ceremonial sword from his side, the blade forged from the metal of fallen stars, and held it upright before him. "By the will of the throne, by the witness of my son, and by the truth of your deeds, I name you guardian of the crown. From this day, you are bound not by chains, but by honor. As protector of the royal bloodline of Vathar, gasps filled the air. The priests fell silent. The soldiers looked at one another in disbelief, and the queen closed her eyes as if releasing a breath she had been holding forever. Kael's face lit with tears that glowed faintly in the golden light. Ryan stood stunned, his voice caught in his throat. I'm just a man," he finally said. The king smiled for the first time in years. "Then perhaps that is what we have been missing all along." And in that vast hall where gods were once feared and silence once ruled, the sound of hope returned. The people bowed not out of obedience, but out of understanding. For the first time in Vathar's long history, a human knelt not as a slave or a trespasser, but as a symbol of unity, an outsider who had reminded an empire that true strength came not from divine blood, but from a heart willing to stand in the fire for another. The War of Shadows peace came to the kingdom of Vathar, but it was a fragile peace, like glass trembling above fire, beautiful, yet ready to shatter with the faintest touch. The ocean that surrounded the floating cities glowed calm once more, but beneath its silver surface, darkness moved. Whispers of betrayal drifted through the halls of nobility, and the distant houses of the outer moons murmured their resentment. To them, the king's decision to raise a human to the title of guardian was not an act of courage, but blasphemy. "He poisons the bloodline," they said. "He corrupts the throne." And though the royal banners still waved proudly above the palace, Ryan could feel the storm gathering beyond the horizon. Silent, slow, and unstoppable. In the months that followed, Ryan's presence changed the palace in ways no one had foreseen. The soldiers trained differently now. Instead of relying on technology and divine rituals, they learned from him how to think with instinct, how to use simplicity against arrogance, how to fight not for pride, but for survival. He taught them endurance, patience, and above all, compassion. "The strongest armor," he told them, "isn't metal or power. It's the reason you're willing to fight." At first they laughed at his words, but soon they began to understand. They saw how even the smallest act of mercy could carry more weight than the grandest show of dominance. The young heir, Kael, followed Ryan everywhere, learning not only the tactics of war but the meaning of courage. But as Kael grew wiser, the enemies of the throne grew bolder. Far beyond the vain sea, the outer houses united under a shadowed leader, a lord named Vornas, a figure of noble blood and poisoned heart. Once a loyal general, Vornas had lost his family during the human trade conflicts that scarred the galaxy years ago, and his hatred for Ryan burned brighter than the suns themselves. To him, the humans' rise to power was an insult to every drop of alien blood spilled in those wars. "The king has surrendered his crown to a creature of weakness," he said before his armies. "We will cleanse our world. We will drown the human and all who follow him." And so began the secret war, a war not of armies clashing openly but of spies, assassins, and quiet betrayals whispered through the corridors of the royal city. Ryan knew it was coming long before the first blade was drawn. He could feel it in the way soldiers avoided his gaze, in the silence that filled the barracks, in the way the queen's smiles had grown faint and tired. He had fought wars before. He knew the scent of rebellion when it crept through the air. Late one night, as he stood on the palace balcony overlooking the silver tides, Kael joined him. The young prince was taller now, his face older, his eyes filled with quiet fire. "They hate you," Kael said softly, his voice low but steady. "They fear what you've shown them. They fear change." Ryan nodded, his gaze lost in the horizon. "Fear makes people dangerous, Kael. They'll come for me. And when they do, they'll come for you too." Kael clenched his fists. "Then let them come. I won't hide behind walls anymore. I'll fight beside you." Ryan turned to face him, his expression half proud, half sad. "A king doesn't fight beside his guardian," he said. "He fights for his people. Your war isn't with swords, Kael. It's with hearts." But fate had already chosen its path. The attack came at dawn 2 weeks later, silent and swift. Under the cover of the rising light, enemy ships cloaked in darkness descended upon the royal city. Their engines made no sound, their weapons gleamed with cold purpose, The alarm screamed through the towers as the sky erupted in streaks of fire. The outer houses had come to take back the throne, and their first target was not the king. It was the human. Ryan woke to the sound of explosions tearing through the palace walls. Without hesitation, he grabbed his weapon and rushed toward the lower hangars where the civilians were evacuating. The corridors shook as beams of energy ripped through the air. Alien soldiers, once loyal, now turned their blades on each other, some defending the king, others betraying him. Amid the chaos, Kael's voice echoed over the comms, filled with panic yet command. "Guardian, fall back! You can't hold them!" But Ryan ignored the order. He had made a promise to protect the bloodline, and he would keep it until his last breath. He reached the main gate just as the enemy breached it. The first wave of attackers stormed through, armored and relentless, but Ryan met them head-on. His movements were fluid, precise, born of years of survival and instinct. The alien blades hissed through the air, but the human fought with something their machines could never mimic: raw will. Each strike he delivered carried not anger but purpose. Behind him, the royal soldiers rallied, their fear burned away by the sight of their human guardian standing unbroken amid fire and death. Above them, Kael and the king directed the defense, their voices blending with the thunder of battle. The queen moved among the wounded, her robes stained with blood and smoke, her calm never faltering. As the enemy pressed closer, Ryan found himself surrounded, his weapon broken, his armor shattered. Still, he refused to yield. "If this is how it ends," he thought, "then let it end standing." But just when the tide seemed ready to drown him, the skies split open. From the upper docks, the royal fleet descended, the banners of Vathar shining once more. The battle raged for hours, until the oceans below turned dark with smoke and debris. When the final explosion faded, the silence that followed was deafening. The enemy had retreated, leaving behind their dead and their pride. Ryan stood among the wreckage, bleeding and exhausted, surrounded by soldiers who now looked upon him not as a stranger, but as one of their own. Kael approached him, his face streaked with ash, and said softly, "They wanted to destroy you, but instead, they've made you a legend." Ryan smiled faintly, his voice low and tired. "Legends are just stories told by survivors. Kael, let's make sure we stay alive long enough to finish this one." And as dawn rose over the ruined kingdom, the people of Vathar began to whisper a new name across the waves: the human guardian. Some said he was sent by fate, others said he was forged by the storm itself. But whatever the truth, one thing had become certain: the war of shadows had begun, and humanity's light was no longer something the galaxy could ignore. The future of a king years passed since the flames of rebellion had scorched the skies of Vathar, and though time had healed the scars upon the city, it could not erase the memories burned into the hearts of those who had lived through the war of shadows. The floating palace had been rebuilt, grander than before, its towers now engraved with symbols of unity between species. The old banners of isolation had been replaced with a new crest, an image of two hands, one human and one alien, reaching toward each other across a wave of silver light. It was more than a symbol, it was a promise. Vathar had been reborn, and its people had learned that strength was not found in purity or pride, but in the courage to stand together. The king, once a ruler bound by the chains of ancient faith, had grown old and quiet, his body frail but his spirit unbroken. He often sat by the palace balcony, gazing out at the glowing ocean below, listening to the sound of the waves as if they whispered forgiveness. The queen remained his anchor, wise and steadfast, her heart forever grateful to the human who had changed their destiny. And beside them, no longer a boy but a man, stood King Kael, the heir who had risen from the sea, the ruler who carried both alien blood and human heart within him. His eyes, once full of innocence and fear, now burned with calm authority. The people called him the ocean-born king, for he had survived death itself and learned compassion from the one they once called the outsider. Ryan still lived within the palace, though time had etched deep lines into his face and silvered his hair. He moved slower now, but his eyes remained sharp, his voice steady, and his soul untamed. To many he had become a legend whispered about in classrooms, painted upon murals, sung about by travelers across the galaxy. But Ryan never saw himself as a hero. He was simply a man who had acted when others had hesitated. Even so, he could not deny the quiet pride that filled him when he saw the world around him changed by that one act of defiance so many years ago. On the morning of Kael's coronation, the entire kingdom gathered. The twin suns rose over the ocean, scattering gold light across the waves, and the air shimmered with hope. Hundreds of ships hovered in the skies, their lights flickering like distant stars, carrying delegates from across the known worlds, humans, aliens, and hybrids alike. They came not to witness the crowning of a ruler, but to witness the birth of a new era. Ryan stood at the edge of the grand hall, dressed in ceremonial armor that he had refused to polish, its scratches and burns left as memories of every battle fought in silence. The royal guards bowed to him as he passed, but he waved them off with a faint smile. He had never cared for titles, and though the world called him guardian of the crown, he still thought of himself as the same man who had once leapt into the sea for a child. When Kael stepped forward to receive the crown, the entire hall fell silent. The ancient priests of Vathar, now reformed into servants of unity rather than fear, raised the ceremonial light above his head. The king's voice, weakened by age, carried through the chamber. "Let it be known across every star," he declared, "that the crown of Vathar no longer belongs to one race, one god, or one blood. It belongs to all who live with courage." He placed the crown upon Kael's head, and as the crowd erupted in thunderous applause, Kael turned, not to the throne, not to the sea, but to Ryan. Their eyes met across the hall. For a moment neither spoke, for no words were needed. In that gaze was every battle, every choice, every sacrifice that had brought them here. Kael raised his hand, and the hall fell silent once more. "My father built this world with strength," he said. "My mother healed it with wisdom. But it was a human, a stranger from the stars, who taught me what it means to be a king." He looked out at the gathered millions. A king's duty is not to rule, but to protect. Not to command, but to serve. From this day forward, the bond between human and Vatharian will never again be broken. The hall erupted again, not with division, but with unity. Even those who had once hated the human now bowed in respect. The queen wept softly, her hand over her heart, and the old king closed his eyes in peace. Ryan stood still, his throat tightening, his vision blurred by emotion he had long buried beneath iron composure. He did not smile. Instead, he bowed his head slowly, a gesture of silent acknowledgement. Later that evening, after the celebrations had ended and the city shimmered with starlight, Kael found Ryan standing on the same balcony where he had stood so many times before, gazing out over the calm ocean that had once nearly claimed them both. For a long while neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of waves below. Finally, Kael broke the silence. "You could have left long ago," he said quietly. "You could have gone back to your own people. Why did you stay?" Ryan took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe I wanted to see what became of you," he said. "Maybe I wanted to know if all that pain meant something. Maybe I found home here." Kael smiled faintly, his voice soft but strong. "You've done more than anyone ever could. You've given us hope. The galaxy speaks your name with reverence. You are part of our history now." Ryan chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "History has a short memory, Kael. Someday they'll forget my name, and that's fine, as long as they remember the lesson." He looked at the young king, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the twin moons. "That no matter what blood runs through your veins, it's the heart that decides who you are." The two stood in silence once more, watching as the silver light of dawn spread across the sea. Below, at the shore where the statue had been raised, a sculpture of a human hand reaching through the storm to save a child. A group of children played, their laughter echoing across the water. The inscription beneath the statue shimmered in the rising sun. When one hand reached across the storm, a future was born. As the wind carried those words through the endless halls of the city, Ryan smiled faintly. He turned toward Kael, the light of the suns catching the edges of his weathered face. "You'll be a good king," he said. Kael nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "Because you taught me how to be human." And as the twin suns rose higher, washing the world in gold, the ocean below seemed to glow brighter, as if the sea itself, once feared as the god of judgment, now bowed in peace to the courage of a single human heart that had changed the destiny of a kingdom forever.